And while people are joining, I put this in the chat already, but thank you to the audience for joining us. But if you do have questions along the way, there should be a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Please feel free to type whatever any questions you have for our presenters or just generally kind of about Project 2025 in there, and we will try to get to them after the presentations are over. We should have plenty of time for to take some questions towards the end. So, excellent. All righty. Okay. All right. Well, if it's okay, I think we will. The numbers seem to have slowed off to a trickle of people joining us from the waiting room. So I think if it's okay, we'll go ahead and get going. Please allow me to welcome you here to this webinar on Project 2025, an explainer about kind of what it is and how it may impact you going forward. My name is Matthew Gabriel. I'm a professor in the Department of Religion and Culture at Virginia Tech, and I'm happy to be your host and moderator here. And I'll introduce our speakers in just a minute. I do want to thank Virginia Tech and our department for allowing us to put on this event with other supporters across the university, of course. It seemed particularly appropriate to do a little explainer on Project 2025 at Virginia Tech once people started to learn about what Project 2025 was, because two of the architects of Trumpism, well, one of the architects of Trumpism and then one of the architects of Project 2025 are Hokie alumni. Steve Bannon is an undergraduate alumnus of Virginia Tech, and Kevin Roberts, who is the head of the Heritage Foundation, under which Project 2025 was created, is a master's alumnus from Virginia Tech as well. So there is this Hokie connection to the document. For those of you who aren't aware, kind of generally, I'll put a link in the chat in just a moment to Project 2025, which is a 900-page document which was created under the auspices of the Heritage Foundation, but with a host of other conservative-leaning or right-leaning organizations as well, contributing, including former Trump officials, officials from the Trump administration, I should say, among many others, laying out kind of policy positions on a variety of things. And because it is such a massive document and it has been referenced so much kind of in political discourse during this election season, it seemed appropriate that we gather some experts here to just discuss at least a little bits of it within their areas of expertise. And so to that end, I'll be happy to introduce our speakers, and then I will kind of fade into the background and allow them to give them presentations, and then I'll come back for the Q&A. So, and the presentations will be like 5 or 10 minutes on various topics, and then we'll have lots of time for questions. So first, I'd like to introduce Professor Elizabeth Cohen, who is the Maxwell Professor of U.S. Citizenship at Boston University. She'll be speaking with us today on immigration and issues related to deportation, things like that, as that is laid out in the document. Professor Donald Moynihan, Don Moynihan, is a professor of public policy at the Ford School at the University of Michigan. And he'll be talking a little bit about what's called Schedule F and civil services protection and the changes that are proposed within the document to those protections. Sarah Posner is an investigative journalist and a columnist for MSNBC, also the author of Unholy, about evangelical Christians and the Trump administration. And she'll be speaking about Project 2025 and Christian nationalism specifically. And then last but certainly not least is Adam Serwer, who is a staff writer at The Atlantic. Of course, I'm sure you've read many of his columns, but of course, he may be better known for the book that came out recently of his columns, The Cruelty is the Point, which came out a few years ago. And he'll be speaking kind of about free speech issues, especially related to, or a window through pornography, which has been in the news quite a bit lately as well. So thank you everyone again for joining us. And without further ado, I will go into the background and I'll turn it over to Elizabeth. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thanks for organizing the event. I'm going to just dive straight into immigration-related issues in Project 2025. The 3 goals of the Project 2025 policies on immigration are to close almost every lawful path to immigrate to the United States, to engage in a mass deportation. It's hard to gauge the numbers of people, but many, many millions of people. And then to denaturalize large numbers of U.S. citizens. What's not in there is a really super detailed plan for exactly how this would happen. The arrests, deportation, detentions. There's a little bit of detail. I'll try and talk about this, but I don't think that means that given a chance, the architects of 2025, the document would not do everything that they say they would do and more. And also, I think it's important to remember that a good bit of what's in there has been done before. In some cases is ongoing, and it's simply an extension of things that are happening now. Let me say I'm going to focus on the two kind of chapters of the document where you see immigration discussed. It's chapter on Department of Homeland Security, if you're interested, and then also Department of Justice. The chapter on Homeland Security was written by Ken Cuccinelli, who you may remember was Deputy Director of USCIS for a while. Then he became acting director. And that allowed him, well, he was in charge of legal systems for immigration and naturalization, but also that allowed him to eventually become head of Department of Homeland Security through a very unusual route without being confirmed. The chapter on the Department of Justice was written by Gene Hamilton, who is probably second only to Stephen Miller in his devotion to moving the U.S. in a more restrictionist direction. And then there's a related organization, Russell Vought, heads up the Center for Renewing America, and they've been writing hundreds of executive orders and memos that a president could use as soon as he or she takes office. And he was the director of OMB under Trump, policy director of the RNC committee that rewrote the official platform this year for the Republican Party, and he's been floated as a possible Trump chief of staff. And if you look on that website, what you'll see is it's basically a defense of great replacement theory, and then advocates various conspiracy theories about attempts to rig the election. There's also in there a defense of the power of the president to use the military to repel invasion and solve the border crisis. So diving into immigration, Project 2025, I would say goes significantly further than the first Trump administration went during its first term, and calls to dismantle DHS and recombine ICE and CBP, Customs and Border Protection, Immigration Customs Enforcement, which basically looks like a return to pre-2002 in a superficial sense, but is a little bit more dramatic than that. But you may remember, or some of us are old enough to remember that before 2002, this was called the Immigration and Naturalization Service. It also calls to replace every member of the DHS committee, in other words, installing loyalists and firing career experts. And they want the new DHS staff to be active worldwide, which does represent a departure, and to lean more heavily than we currently do on other countries to start pushing back people attempting to approach the US border. It also calls for deploying active duty military and National Guardsmen to the border. And here it may be useful to point out that for legal purposes, the border, at least right now, is any place within 100 miles of the physical border of the United States, which means that approximately 2/3 of the US population is in the border zone for legal purposes. And that means that the military and the National Guard will functionally be everywhere that most of us are. The document says that the DHS budget is bloated, and then it goes on to call for policies that would cost considerably more, I think, than is currently allocated in the budgets of these agencies. Maybe some of the spending they think will, they give some detail, but they gloss over a lot of it. Pretty much every way that somebody could come to the United States right now or receive legal status after they've arrived is under attack in the document. So they want to order ICE to stop deprioritizing the deportation of people who are unlawfully present but have been determined to not pose a threat to anyone. They want to order ICE to incarcerate mass numbers of immigrants, and kind of implies that there are vulnerabilities even in the student visa realm. So those are people who are lawfully present for short periods of time. They want to rescind rules that identify sensitive zones where ICE personnel is not supposed to operate, and then maximize expedited removal, probably, I think it's generally agreed, at the cost of due process. I think it's notable that they want to be able to deport all unaccompanied minors. Right now, the U.S. can only return unaccompanied minors to contiguous countries. And they want to relax current limits on where and how deportations can take place. The document calls to end completely the T and the U visas, which are given to survivors of crime. I think notably, we think a lot about survivors of trafficking and violence against women who are cooperating with law enforcement to investigate and prosecute those cases. And then it calls for USCIS to pause receiving applications for a given period of time if backlogs become excessive. And it seems like I'm kind of interpreting here, but the plan is that a backlog could be engineered by understaffing, which is something that's already a problem. That would then just cause new submissions for naturalization and immigration to be paused indefinitely. The approach to asylum is profoundly skeptical. So the document calls to reduce applications for asylum, which they say are too numerous to adjudicate. And they're concerned that there's a great deal of fraud in there. They want to raise the bar that asylum applicants currently face, which generally, as you progress through the process, becomes pretty high already. And they want to eliminate the classification in the asylum laws for protected social groups. They want either Department of Homeland Security secretary or its functional equivalent, if they succeed in eliminating the department, to be able to respond to anticipated humanitarian crises that might lead to a mass displacement by issuing countrywide bans on people to basically prevent people from any place where there might be a displacement from entering the United States. And that would just be subject to the approval of the president. So there's no other real procedure for that. And then they also want to move to reduce temporary visas to the United States. So they want to move toward allowing country-based preferences for H-2B visas, seasonal non-agricultural work. They want to clamp down on the public charge rule, the asylum bars rule, and then third country transit rules. These are often used as rationale for refusing to even hear asylum pleas. They want to hunt for employed immigrants who can be deemed ineligible for employment, and then reduce or eliminate family reunification and immigration lotteries, and then only very selectively issue what are considered high skilled work visas. They want to end temporary protected status, which they don't say directly, but seems to mean that all people who have temporary protected status in the US right now, probably between like 500,000 and 1 million, depending on when you count, would be deported. And in addition, quite ominously, I think they call for stepping up programs to denaturalize US citizens and expand efforts to criminally prosecute people who are being denaturalized. The document wants to effectively nullify Flores. We heard a lot about Flores during the first Trump administration, and that generally is what prevents the government from detaining children and families indefinitely. They would reinstate remain in Mexico, which forces people to wait in Mexico while asylum cases are pending. Some of this is happening now, but this would be, I think, a dramatic still rewriting. And then heavily penalize countries that refuse to accept deportees from the United States. The document says that immigration and customs enforcement officials should be directed to take any unauthorized immigrant with any kind of past criminal record or deportation order, or just who have been identified by local police into custody. A few more things that I think are worth noting. The part of ICE that's called Homeland Security investigations. They're generally officers who are tasked with very sensitive investigations. It's where most of the true national security stuff in DHS that relates to immigration is happening, but not just immigration. They would all be reassigned to focus exclusively on immigration crimes, just to free up manpower for a deportation effort. They want to raise ICE's budget, of course. They want to expand detention capacity to 100,000 beds. Just as a point of reference, in 2019, the Trump administration was asking for 52,000 beds. They also want to loosen detention standards and create what they call soft-sided facilities, which are basically tent cities. You may remember Joe Arpaio, the sheriff of Maricopa County, was requiring prisoners in tents to wear pink, non-citizens to wear pink underwear. But basically, they're calling for camps without calling them camps. And of course, then they want to beef up. They say they will kind of complete construction on the wall. So I can talk a little bit about the cost of all this, but I think the allotted time for me to speak is up. And so I just want to pass the mic over to Don, Professor Moynihan.
Thanks so much, Elizabeth. Thanks everyone for being here. My background is in public administration, and I'm going to focus on that. And so I think the mandate for leadership document that Matt shared and the broader Project 2025 is interesting as a policy document. It's quite radical in many ways, but I think it's extraordinarily revealing as a document that tells us about how a second Trump administration or a similar Republican administration in the future intends to govern, how they use governance powers in the United States, because I think there's some fairly dramatic changes from the status quo. One thing that is unusual about Project 2025 relative to prior versions, and prior versions means going back to 1980, the Heritage Foundation has published something called Mandate for Leadership every presidential election cycle to help Republican presidents govern. But this year, one thing that they did differently was to also build in this recruiting mechanism where they sought to recruit 20,000 potential political appointees who could start to work in a second Trump administration on day one. And that is unusual for reasons I'll come back to in a little bit. But what it suggests is an appetite for both having vetted loyalists, people who are full-on MAGA believers, and this reflects Trump's beliefs that he didn't have enough of these, even among his own political appointees. And B, it reflects the idea that there will be room for those people in the second Trump administration. Currently, the United States has about 4,000 political appointee slots. There's 20,000 people being lined up. That math doesn't really add up. And so what that means is a lot of career bureaucrats will ultimately be removed to make space for those new political appointees. How are they going to do that? The main mechanism by which they'll do that is an executive order called Schedule F. Schedule F was signed at the end of Trump's term in office in late October, just a couple of weeks before the election. Did not get much attention. It was rescinded by the Biden administration. What Schedule F does is give the president the power to reclassify career civil servants, so people who joined the bureaucracy through some merit-based process, and turn them into political appointees. That is to say, people who were brought into government primarily because of their loyalty to a presidential candidate. And so what we see then with Schedule F is that Trump or another presidential candidate could basically turn these officials into political appointees and then fire them. And so the crucial thing about Schedule F is that it would remove job protections from career bureaucrats. It would turn them into at-will employees. They serve at the pleasure of the president. And so if Trump thinks you're part of the deep state, he can fire you. If his political appointees disagree with you on some issue, they can fire you. And so, for example, when we hear today about RFK Jr. Helping to identify leadership candidates for key scientific regulatory agencies, what that means is that those political appointees that RFK Jr. and Trump would agree on would be able to fire scientists because they disagree with their view about what is the good science when it comes to things like vaccines. For you as a citizen, this means that vaccine safety or other regulatory activities having to do with, let's say, food safety, air, water, or workplace safety would become more driven by the whims of political appointees. It would also be much harder for career bureaucrats to raise concerns about being ignored when it comes to making crucial decisions on things like public health. Uh, so we do have a fair bit of research on the effects of politicization on the bureaucracy, both in the United States and in other countries. And the bottom line is that it's not good. It tends to be associated with lower government capacity and lower government performance. And this is because career bureaucrats tend to accumulate expertise and knowledge over time. They're selected because they know what they're doing, and they get better at what they're doing over time. Whereas political appointees tend to come into office for 18 to 24 months. They have less experience, they have less expertise, and they are going to be more driven by political ideology in their decision making. So it's reasonable to assume they are not going to be as effective when it comes to actually delivering public services. A second concern with Schedule F is simply sort of democratic backsliding concerns. And here we can think of many examples, but let's take Trump's first impeachment as an example. If you remember Trump's first impeachment, he was impeached for withholding aid from Ukraine when he was attempting to get political dirt on his likely 2020 opponent. This was illegal. It's also unconstitutional. There's something called the Impoundment Act that says congressionally appropriated funds cannot be withheld by the president. Trump and Russ Vought, who was mentioned earlier, do not believe the Impoundment Act is constitutional. They would like to simply withhold funds when they see fit. And what happened in this case is you had career bureaucrats playing two roles, which I think reflect the way in which they do protect democratic values. First of all, these career bureaucrats, both at OMB and the Pentagon, were saying to the White House, hey, this is illegal. We don't think you can do this. We need to have some legal guidance about why you think this is allowed. Trump had OMB general counsel who provided a legal rationale, which was not based in any constitutional law, but basically said Trump can do whatever he wants with this. And then later on, when the hold was revealed and there was congressional hearings, Trump told political officials working for him, you cannot testify to Congress, you cannot share any information. And most of the officials who did testify were career bureaucrats. So they were the ones who were providing accountability to Congress, providing an account of what happened. Trump took this very personally. In the aftermath of the impeachment, he tried to penalize as many of these career bureaucrats as he could. He kicked some out of the White House. He removed promotions from others. And ultimately, he didn't go as far as he could, but with Schedule F, he would simply fire these officials. And so their ability to tell us about wrongdoing in the White House or to raise red flags as officials would be greatly diminished when they would have to worry for their job for providing that information. When you ally this with Trump's plans to remove general counsels across the government, so general counsels are the sort of internal legal watchdogs who tell presidents what's legal or illegal, and replace those with Trump loyalist lawyers, and Stephen Miller has been involved in trying to recruit these lawyers. What you have is this broad era of permissiveness where the president can do effectively whatever he wants. And worryingly, the Supreme Court, I think, has encouraged this with their immunity decision this summer. Through a series of decisions that targeted and weakened the administrative state, I think it left the state much weaker, but it also allowed a strongman type of presidency in a way we have not seen before. Ultimately, there is a lot we still actually don't know about Project 2025. So earlier, Elizabeth mentioned Russ Vought, who was one of Trump's biggest champions. OMB director is now running the Center for Renewing America. Among other things, Vought is tasked with writing a 180-day playbook, which will turn many of the policy goals that's in Project 2025 into practical executive orders or other sorts of policy guidance. And notably, That part of Project 2025 is secret. There is no release of the 180-day playbook. We know very little about it, even though it's very clear that this will become the blueprint for a second Trump administration. In talking about this to undercover reporters, Vaught said, I want to be the person that crushes the deep state. And he is centrally focused on destroying the career bureaucracy as the means to help Trump govern. I'll conclude by saying it's no exaggeration to say this would be certainly the most dramatic change to the civil service system we've seen since it was created 140 years ago. And I think it would also be a fundamental change to the balance of power in how presidents govern, in a way I think that would fundamentally actually strengthen the president, but weaken the ability of the public to hold that president accountable. I'll stop there. I'm looking forward to Sarah's comments. Thank you.
Thanks, Don. So from its opening pages, the Project 2025 document that Matt put in the chat here lays out a Christian nationalist agenda and Christian nationalist ambitions for the federal government. And I wanted to add on to something that Don said about Russ Vought putting together this 180-day plan. Russ Vought has also expressed support for Christian nationalism and for having the federal government run from a Christian nationalist perspective. And in its opening pages, in the foreword by Kevin Roberts, the president of the Heritage Foundation, the document talks about restoring the family as the centerpiece of American life and to protect our children, to secure our God-given individual rights to live freely. And what that really means is Christian nationalists believe that their freedom has been infringed upon by rights and freedoms for LGBTQ people, rights and freedoms for people to be free from the entwinement of church and state, and reproductive freedom, abortion, contraception. And so throughout the document, there are references to family, marriage, and in that context, the document confines marriage and family to, straight marriage between a man and a woman, and families only, headed by a husband and a wife and children, but no, completely cisgender heteronormative marriage and family. And everything that is done by the left is depicted as a diabolical plot to destroy that. So what they want to do is make the federal government, turn the federal government into a mechanism for them to institute policies that would reinforce and enforce this kind of ideology around individual freedom, autonomy, marriage, and family. And so he says in the document, it's time for policymakers to elevate family authority formation and cohesion as their top priority, and even use government power, including through the tax code, to restore the American family. The next conservative president must make the institutions of American civil society hard targets for woke culture warriors. This starts with deleting terms like sexual orientation and gender identity, diversity, equity, inclusion, gender equality, gender equity, reproductive health, reproductive rights, abortion. These things are characterized as infringements on the First Amendment rights, the free speech and religious freedom rights of conservative Christians who oppose those things. And the Department of Health and Human Services is ground zero for this, although their ambitions extend to other federal agencies as well. And the Heritage Foundation official who drafted the section on the Department of Health and Human Services, Roger Severino, headed up that department's Office of Civil Rights in the first Trump administration. And he has said publicly that if you want to think about what HHS would do in a second Trump term, look at the first Trump term. And so none of that, Trump running away from Project 2025. Severino has made it clear that like what they tried to do in his first term, they would try to do again, plus more. So some of the things that they envision in Project 2025 include using a 19th century anti-obscenity law to ban abortion nationwide, to use the FDA, which is part of the Department of Health and Human Services, to withdraw approval of mifepristone, a very commonly used abortion medication, to classify IUDs and Plan B as abortifacients so that employers would not have to cover them in their healthcare plans, even though they're required under the Affordable Care Act to cover contraception without a copay. They want to use the Centers for Disease Control, which are also part of HHS, to promote what they call modern fertility-based methods of birth control, that is ovulation observation, as opposed to above other methods. But this is, of course, a method that is used by people who oppose contraception. They want to use religious freedom arguments to give special exemptions to Christian adoption and foster care agencies who want to turn away same-sex couples as prospective parents or discriminate against non-Christian couples as parents. They want to roll back non-discrimination rules that protect trans patients from discrimination in healthcare. And it generally argues that they want to get rid of Biden-era policies and replace them with policies that support the formation of stable, married, nuclear families. They claim very broadly that gender ideology, which is their scare term for LGBTQ rights and freedom, is a destructive dogma, and that HHS should pursue a robust agenda to protect the fundamental right to life, protect conscience rights, and uphold bodily integrity rooted in biological realities, not ideology. So what they're claiming here is that being trans is not real, that it's just an ideology or a destructive dogma of the left, and that everything should be rooted in what they call biological realities, which is really just their religious beliefs. They proposed something that they tried unsuccessfully to do during Trump's first term, which is to punish blue states by withdrawing federal funding to the state or to hospitals in the state because of their position on abortion. The document explicitly proposes cutting off Medicaid funding to California, or states like California that require abortion services in health insurance, coverage of abortion services in health insurance. It proposes that the Office of Refugee Resettlement, another component of HHS in its broad portfolio of providing public health and social services to the American public, they propose that the Office of Refugee Resettlement stop allowing girls, minors, who have been often, sex trafficked, sexually assaulted, and are seeking, refugee status in the United States, of stopping the agency from referring them or allowing them to get abortions. And it suggests things like in terms of this monitoring the type of family that people have, that it suggests monitoring recipients of temporary assistance to needy families, to monitor them for marriage, healthy family formation, and delaying sex to prevent pregnancy. And to address deadbeat dads, child support enforcement should, quote, strengthen marriage as the norm, restore broken homes, and encourage unmarried couples to commit to marriage. They even propose requiring clinics that receive funding under Title X, which provides family planning services, to provide information to customers on the importance of marriage to family and personal well-being. And they also want to require religious liberty protections for faith-based providers of federally funded services so that they can maintain a biblically based definition of marriage and family as a heterosexual intact marriage. So this is just in HHS. They are trying to take these religious ideas about individual autonomy, freedom, reproductive freedom, sexual freedom, marriage, family, and impose their religious beliefs. And I've focused on HHS, but these intentions are not limited to HHS, but that's the most dangerous one because of the breadth of the HHS portfolio. So with that, I'm going to pass it off to Adam.
Thank you, Sarah. And I think, the truth is that my topic has a lot of overlap with yours. I want to talk a little bit about the conservatives' obsession with pornography, and I don't mean the many stories of the obsessive porn habits of religious conservative politicians, even though news stories about them seem to break every day. I want to talk about the introduction to Project 2025, written by the Heritage Foundation's Kevin Roberts, which states that, quote, children suffer the toxic normalization of transgenderism with drag queens and pornography invading their school libraries. Roberts goes on to explain that, quote, pornography manifested today in the omnipresent propagation of transgender ideology and sexualization of children, for instance, is not a political Gordian knot inextricably binding disparate claims about free speech, property rights, sexual liberation, and child welfare. It has no claim to First Amendment protection. Its purveyors are child predators and misogynistic exploiters of women. Their product is as addictive as any illicit drug and as psychologically destructive as any crime. Pornography should be outlawed. The people who produce and distribute it should be in prison. Educators and public librarians who purvey it should be classified as registered sex offenders. And communications and technology firms that facilitate its spread should be shuttered. It may surprise some of you to hear a Trump supporter being very concerned, about misogynistic exploiters of women. But I think, I want to focus on this description because it's clear that when Roberts is talking about pornography in the context of libraries or, quote, transgender ideology, he's not talking about what we generally consider porn, which is prurient material produced for the purposes of sexual arousal. He's talking about criminally prosecuting people essentially for producing or hosting LGBT content. This is a definition of pornography that would encompass, like Will and Grace or Modern Family. Trump has not taken a position on banning pornography, which would be awkward given that he has personally appeared in cameo roles in porn films. But in an interview with reporters, one of the architects of Project 2025 that Sarah mentioned earlier, Russell Vaught, said Trump was merely, quote, running against the brand of Project 2025, adding that he was, quote, he was not even, quote, opposing himself to a particular policy. He also noted that, quote, Trump is very supportive of what we do. And I think, a way to summarize Christian nationalism, in the way that Sarah was talking about is, it's not a freedom of religion, even though they use that language. It is a freedom of imposition of religion, and specifically a very specific conservative interpretation of Christianity that they have a right to impose on everybody else. But the idea here is, envision here is a means to criminalize LGBT expression, a sort of backdoor way to introduce the kind of morality laws you see in some Eastern European countries like Russia. Once upon a time in the old morality codes, under the old morality codes, such as the Hays Code, these things barred descriptions of homosexuality in American film, and this is sort of an attempt to bring us back to that kind of era. The problem is today, the social mores of Americans have changed. Most Americans support LGBT people having constitutional rights, including the right to get married, and no longer regard homosexuality as a moral failure. And that is the problem that outlawing, quote, pornography is meant to solve, the absence of a stigma on behavior that conservatives believe should be stigmatized. And if people won't get there on their own, then conservatives are just going to have to use the law to do it. It's a short hop also from criminalizing LGBT expression on the grounds that it is obscene to doing the same for topics like abortion. And the purpose of this is to create an exception to free speech protections under the First Amendment and then shoehorn any form of expression conservatives disapprove of into that exception. People, much less children, do not go to the library to find porn, but they might go there and find ideas that conservatives disagree with, and they don't want anyone to do that. So you might say, well, they're just criminalizing porn and then prosecute people for forbidden materials that conservatives object to on ideological grounds, not because they actually constitute pornography as people generally understand it. As Melissa J. Grant writes in the New Republic, quote, Project 2025 is not targeting pornography as something that's harmful to children per se, but rather redefining anything concerning sexuality and gender that they say is harmful to children as pornography. This is clear when you look at other things Roberts considers worthy of censorship. He writes that, quote, the noxious tenets of critical race theory and gender ideology should be excised from curricula in every public school in the country. These theories poison our children. And this is sort of the strategy. You say you're doing it for the children, and then you can just throw the Constitution out the window. And sometimes you don't even need that. As we've seen, Trump has publicly called for the government to punish news organizations for critical coverage and for people who criticize the Supreme Court to be prosecuted. I look forward to being subject to that kind of prosecution if he actually wins. Although Roberts has called a ban pornography is not elaborated on in a mandate for leadership in a policy sense, his calls for educational censorship are reflected in a federal ban modeled on the sort of critical race theory bills, the effect of which, as PEN America writes, has been to effectively chill education about slavery, racism, white supremacy, and to facilitate bans on thousands of books that touch on issues including race, sexuality, and gender. Now, ultimately, these efforts may be ultimately unconstitutional in some cases. The Roberts Court has been a little more consistent on First Amendment issues than in other areas. When I say consistent, I mean consistent with prior rulings that have taken very expansive positions on free speech, including corporate speech. But litigation on these issues takes time. And the point of these laws is less to enforce them than to use their presence to chill conversations in advance and use the power of the state to stigmatize forms of expression conservatives find offensive. Roberts' language makes clear that it's not just individuals who wants to censor, but corporations that host the content he disagrees with. Project 2025 is expression of the belief that most Trumpists today share, which is one that defines freedom of speech as the right to say what conservatives want you to say. And its attack on pornography is merely a Trojan horse for eroding free speech more broadly. It begins the same way many attacks on fundamental rights do, by focusing on a target that many people may find unsympathetic. And that's it for me. So we can move on to the Gabe in the Q&A section if folks are ready.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you to all the presenters. I think these were really comprehensive. We have some great questions in the Q&A, along with some people who couldn't make it but emailed me, and so I'll try to incorporate those as much as possible. The first question, I'm going to try to kind of combine a few questions here. One of them is the connection of Trump to Project 2025, which has been kind of a consistent question. Trump, of course, has publicly disavowed it. Whether or not that's accurate or not, I think is not a particularly controversial thing, because it seems to be certainly written by many members of the former Trump administration. And as you guys have mentioned, Russ Vought said Trump knows about this and is aware of this and looked to previous administrations. But I was wondering, within your own kind of areas, like, does it seem particularly clear that this is connected to the Trump administration? One thing I will mention, which people may not be aware of, is that J.D. Vance, the current vice presidential candidate, wrote the foreword to the document itself. So he's very aware of what's going on there. So.
I think this is a fair question. Trump has tried to distance himself from Project 2025. The issue is that the people who he would hire are the people who believe things like this or who literally wrote these documents. And I think to some extent, if you remember the Trump presidency, it was a lot of him watching Fox News and then issuing executive orders with his or making policy decisions with his remote in his hand. So I think there's a sense among these people who are aspiring bureaucrats in the second Trump administration that they're going to have sort of unsupervised recess, and are going to get to do what they want to do unless, Trump specifically interferes. And so I think, on the one hand, I do, I do not think Trump wants to outlaw pornography. I think that, he is not necessarily going to stop people who he hires from trying to do things like that, or trying to narrow free speech rights in a particular way, socially conservative way that he wouldn't necessarily specifically order them to do.
I just wanted to say that Kevin Roberts wrote the foreword for Project 2025. J.D. Vance wrote the foreword to Kevin Roberts's book, which his publisher pulled after excessive attention on Project 2025 and Kevin Roberts and Trump's relationship with them. But let's remember, 140 people involved in the drafting of this document were our former, our alumni of Trump's first term. Trump has flown on Heritage's private plane with Kevin Roberts to give a speech at a Heritage retreat where he extolled Project 2025 and what Heritage was doing or its plans for his second term, a possible second term. And I think there are even other speeches where he praised the Heritage Foundation and what they were doing. So I think it's pretty obvious to us, and maybe not so obvious to other people, that his disavowals are disingenuous. But I think the evidence is there that these are the people he listened to in his first term, will listen to in his second term, and he doesn't really have a plan apart from their plans.
Yeah, I would just add to that. If you look at the actual people who were tasked with running Project 2025, the director was Paul Dans. Spencer Chrétien is the associate director. The other associate director is Troop Hemingway. All of these were Trump officials brought in to work in the Trump administration. And so they're centrally tied to the project. And the most radical elements for me of Project 2025, things like Schedule F, started in the Trump administration. And so there's a clear line of people and policy. And as Sarah pointed out, they are going to be the people that Trump will turn to if he returns to office. There is clearly some real tension between the Trump campaign and his campaign managers and senior people in Project 2025. But if Trump does win, there isn't another team of people he's drawing on. The Project 2025 people is the universe of the governing coalition that Trump will rely on.
I know I already spoke on this, but I just want to add one more thing. When you ask these guys in private whether Trump opposes Project 2025, they say, nah, he's going to let us do it. So I think that evaluation, the architects of this document believe they're going to be allowed to pursue their goals. Whether or not they're successful is a separate question, but they certainly think that regardless of what Trump says in public, that they're the ones who are going to be running his administration when the time comes, if it comes.
I think
Thank you.
he's aware too that Project 2025 right now is polling very badly, with something like 70% of the public having an unfavorable view of it. And so all of his attempts to distance himself from it are just because he knows that it's wildly unpopular with the general public.
Great, thank you. One other thing kind of related to this, several questions about implementation and especially related to the courts. Somebody did ask, they weren't familiar with the immunity decision that somebody referenced, the Roberts case. So if somebody wanted to mention that, but like how did do you have a sense of, kind of within your own areas or generally like how the federal courts might react for some of these things, which might seem, on their face, just kind of baldly unconstitutional?
I think if you asked me at the start of the year whether Schedule F would be deemed constitutional, I would have said maybe there's a 1 in 3 chance. After the summer decisions on that weakened the administrative state and gave Trump very broad immunity, that reflected, I think, a belief in the sort of unitary executive theory of governing, which can be summarized as the president is king, more or less. And so now I think the chances are maybe 2 in 3 that something like Schedule F would be allowed by the current Supreme Court. And I think in part, one thing that helps us to understand the court's thinking is that the majority of the court, 5 members of the court, are former people who worked for Republican presidents who were frustrated by Democratic Congresses and constraints on their power. And so they have personal experience of feeling a sense of frustration that the president was not powerful enough. And I think that does influence their thinking.
Just in the area that I cover, I think that they've actually been emboldened by recent Supreme Court decisions relating to religious freedom and church-state separation, and in particular, the intersection of religious freedom and LGBTQ rights, and above all, the Dobbs decision overturning Roe. So I think that in terms of all of these HHS topics that I talked about, that they feel like the Supreme Court has given them basically a permission structure to do a lot of this stuff.
I saw a question in the chat that is kind of a specific version of this about things related to immigration and particularly naturalized citizens. And I just want to say, don't let the Muslim ban Supreme Court cases mislead. There aren't that many constitutional protections for people who aren't citizens. And it is not unconstitutional to denaturalize people who are US citizens. There are, that's something that happens already. The question is a question of scale. So, I don't think we can really look to the court to protect people from deportation or from kind of reductions of the already slim kinds of due process rights that you might think an immigrant who's well positioned could take advantage of.
I think with the court, if you look at law and precedent, you're likely to be mistaken about what this court is going to do. If, on the other hand, you look at developments in conservative ideology, which, the court is majority conservatives. Those people identify as conservatives. They consume conservative media. They read conservative books. They hang out with other conservatives. Those when an idea becomes popular on the right, even if it sounds like an absurd, un-American, unconstitutional idea, the chances are that one or two, if not more, if not five, three or four or five or six of the conservative justices on the court are going to ultimately come to think, it's actually a pretty good idea. I mean, I don't think that, a lot of people would have predicted, a few years ago that the Roberts Court would say that the president can, bomb his political opponent if he feels like it, the other guy who's running for president if he feels like it. That happened because the conservative ideology evolved in that direction as a means to defend Trump, as a means to defend Trump doing whatever he wants to do. And as long as conservative ideology flows in that direction, evolves in that direction, then there are really no limits on what the court will countenance. I think or at least there are very few. And they depend on the personal idiosyncrasies of the justices.
Great, thank you. Just maybe a couple more questions if we have a few more minutes left. An interesting question that we're all talking about, or you were all talking about very different kind of aspects, and of course this just covers a little bit of the huge kind of document as a whole. But somebody asked about kind of cleavages. Do you see any kind of cleavages within the groups that were putting this document together, or does it seem like a unified kind of movement? Is that sometimes, people, if they're not following things particularly closely, they hear about kind of different factions, kind of, social conservatives, Christian nationalists, libertarians on the right and things like that. But do you see this, at least within kind of your areas, as coherent, or do you see kind of fissures in which, even internally, maybe within Project 2020, where things aren't kind of jiving with one another? And the answer could be no.
There's been some reporting that there are some things that did not make it into Project 2025 that are being discussed in the 180-day playbook. One of those is more aggressive use of the Insurrection Act to put down protests. And I think from the outside, Project 2025 may feel like a very unified conservative vision, but the actual authors are, within specific policy areas, and they might have some internal disagreements that are not always apparent to us. But I think more of the thing that worries me is that the more radical aspects of the plan that we don't know about are in the hands of people like Russ Vought, who will push the edge of what's feasible.
I want to just add that my concern, or like, I'm a little bit more worried that rather than there being fissures in the people who are kind of associated with Project 2025, with respect to what I spoke about, I'm a little more concerned that they're going to be able to leverage things that Democrats have done to tighten up enforcement, engage in denaturalization, deportation, and you know, I think it's a good thing for everybody to remember that there was outrage about a lot of things that happened during the Trump administration to non-citizens that disappeared after the Trump administration was over, even though a lot of the actual procedures and their outcomes didn't disappear. So, that's more my concern.
I think conservative elites are very unified on most of the radical aspects of this agenda. I think conservative voters are actually a little cross-pressured, particularly on certain issues such as abortion. I mean, you can see that in the referendums in conservative states where abortion rights have always won. But I think the issue is that when we're talking about who runs the federal government, it's not cross-pressured rank and file Republican voters. It's the elites who have extremely radical beliefs and want to impose them on the country.
There's a couple other questions here, maybe a little bit more specific, but there was a question, and Sarah, you spoke a little bit about this, about the impact on birth control. There has been some talk about Project 2025 kind of moving towards a ban on birth control, and certainly that's kind of come up a couple times in the news. So can you speak, is there any kind of language about that, other than kind of, you mentioned kind of stripping away coverage, ACA protections about coverage for birth control?
Yeah, I mean, I think that they are moving incrementally towards trying to ban certain kinds of birth control or any kind of birth control. So the plan to use the Comstock Act to prosecute the shipment of mifepristone, which is an abortion medication, you could see them then transitioning to, okay, if we succeeded in using the Comstock Act to prosecute that, let's try prosecuting the sale of Plan B through the mail. And the sort of incremental advancement there is that they want to allow employers to opt out of covering IUDs or Plan B, because I will note that the lie that those birth control methods cause an abortion is embedded in the Supreme Court's 2014 decision in Hobby Lobby, which gave employers the religious right to opt out of providing this coverage under the Affordable Care Act in the first place. And Justice Alito, who wrote that opinion, basically embedded that lie in his opinion. And now they're running with this proposal for HHS to say that, well, employers who don't want to fund or cover abortion don't have to fund those methods of birth control. And then third, I would point to them wanting the federal government to take the position that, fertility awareness methods are a superior method of birth control, when all the medical science says no, they are not as effective and reliable as other methods of birth control, is another sign of them wanting to chip away at these other methods of birth control. And, we know that Justice Thomas, in his concurrence in the Dobbs case, talked about wanting to overrule Griswold also, which was a case that struck down the criminalization of the sale of contraception. So, these are all pieces of the puzzle as they move in that direction, but it doesn't just outright say we want to ban birth control.
Thank you very much. We are at 8 o'clock. If it's okay, I'm going to ask, because there are a few questions about this, and this is another specific question. So maybe you could just do this very briefly. The question is probably for Elizabeth, because it's a question about immigration, is about denaturalization. Could you maybe just very briefly kind of explain what that means, at least as far as Project 2025 is concerned? And then kind of generally, like, what would be the impact of that? Kind of generally, there's a question about kind of foreign policy, but even kind of domestically. And, I know that's a small question, but, there you go.
It's not a small question as the daughter of a naturalized citizen. So I think the best analogy to use with respect to denaturalization, which is the stripping of citizenship from somebody who's a naturalized US citizen, is that when the state goes about denaturalizing somebody, it becomes kind of like a legal fiction that the naturalization never happened. So it's like if you were at a wedding where two people got married, you may have seen the wedding, but for the government's purposes, the marriage never happened if it's annulled. And there have been a bunch of efforts to start looking for ostensibly fraudulent naturalization proceedings and then strip citizenship. It happened under the Obama administration. There was a big push on during the Trump administration, and now it's kind of back. And it's incredibly alarming to start thinking about stripping citizenship. So I'd say, like, to me, this is one of the most ominous things, because of course it's one step away from decitizenizing a large number of people. It's lawful. It's difficult to do. Other countries do it. It requires a place to deport the person, so a country willing to accept them. They have to have come from somewhere, and that state has to still exist. But it's entirely lawful.
Great. On that note, well, we are unfortunately out of time. There are still a number of great questions there that we just won't have time to answer. But several people have asked about the recording. We do have permission from the presenters, so this has been recorded. I'll put it up on YouTube pretty soon. I'll share it on social media, and I'll share it via email. So be on the lookout for that if you do want to share that. Let me take this opportunity to thank everyone, our presenters, for joining us and for being willing to share their evening with us, and to everybody here who attended. Thank you for spending your evening with us as well. I hope this was useful, and I hope you'll be able to learn something a little bit more about Project 2025 and kind of how it'll impact you. So thank you again to everybody, and I'll wish everybody just a good night.
Thank you.